Story 1. Anxiety prickled as I sat at the table, my nerves evident. It had been a while since I'd been on a date. Let's fast forward a few weeks. I struck up a conversation with a guy named Johnny on a dating app. The app wasn't great, with only about 100,000 downloads, but I preferred smaller platforms to avoid being inundated with messages. So Johnny and I chatted, and eventually we agreed to meet. We settled on a Chinese restaurant downtown for our first encounter. I can't recall the app's name, but it required at least 3 photos and various stats, like height and weight, though some were optional. Johnny had his profile filled out, standing at 5'10", weighing around 200 pounds with a muscular build. He also had a good appearance with spiked dark hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and seemingly perfect teeth, though I wondered if they were natural. Arriving early, I was grateful that Johnny had made a reservation for 2 the day before. The anticipation swirled as I was escorted to our table. I fretted over whether it was better to arrive first or second to a date, especially with my tendency to clumsiness, particularly in heels. So it was a relief to be seated before Johnny arrived. As I settled in, the server approached and asked if I wanted a drink. I declined, opting to wait for my date out of respect. The server handed me the drinks and food menu, instructing me to peruse the options and decide on my order. I took both menus, casually scanning through. Visiting Chinese restaurants wasn't a novelty for me. The real purpose of being there was the date and getting to know the guy. Minutes ticked by, and he still hadn't arrived. 7 o'clock, our agreed meeting time, came and went. I wasn't overly concerned. Perhaps he encountered traffic or got lost. A couple of minutes delay wasn't a big deal, and I would have waited even if he were 20 minutes late. He had my number, after all. Eventually, he showed up 10 minutes behind schedule. As he entered, the first thing I noticed was that he didn't appear to be 5 feet 10 inches as he claimed. In fact, he seemed closer to my height, around 5'6". It was a red flag, but I reasoned that many guys exaggerate their height. I wasn't going to let it ruin the date, although it was a blatant lie from the start. He approached the table as the waitress guided him over. I stood, greeting him with a hug and a kiss on the cheek, though it felt awkward. Despite his good looks, there was a noticeable lack of confidence. His facial features were chiseled, and his stubble was genuine, thankfully not photoshopped. However, from the outset, something about his demeanor felt off. As we sat down, his leg incessantly shook, a telltale sign of nervousness or restlessness. It was distracting, but I attributed it to first date jitters. Awkward silences permeated the conversation as he inquired about my studies and work, engaging in typical small talk. Eventually, the waitress intervened, alleviating the tension as we placed our drink and starter orders. The food arrived promptly and exceeded expectations. The restaurant was bustling when I arrived shortly before 7. It was relatively quiet. However, by now, 15 to 20 minutes past 7, more patrons had filled the space, likely all with reservations. The restaurant buzzed with chatter, filled to capacity, necessitating raised voices to communicate over the din. It was loud. Despite the noise, we enjoyed our starters, and as we moved on to our main courses, things took a strange turn. The guy became increasingly fidgety, his leg bouncing erratically, at times knocking against the table, causing our glasses and bowls to rattle. He struggled to maintain eye contact, constantly averting his gaze or focusing on his food, never meeting my eyes for more than a fleeting moment. It was shaping up to be one of the worst dates I'd experienced, and the ordeal wasn't over yet. The restaurant was packed with families, couples, and solo diners alike. Midway through the meal, I excused myself to use the restroom, informing Johnny of my brief absence. Upon returning, I found Johnny still seated, engrossed in his meal. However, a peculiar encounter awaited me. As I sat down, a woman from the neighboring table approached abruptly, seizing my drink and insisting that I accompany her outside. Bewildered, I glanced at Johnny, who remained silent, avoiding eye contact. Outside, the woman, roughly my height with gray hair, escorted me away from the restaurant, wine glass in hand. She ensured the door closed firmly behind us before delivering a startling revelation. She claimed to have witnessed Johnny spiking my drink with a fizzing tablet while I was in the restroom. Horrified, she instructed me to leave immediately and never return. With a sense of urgency, she urged me to walk away, warning of the danger posed by Johnny. Glancing back at the restaurant, the gravity of the situation sank in. Johnny rose slowly from his table, his gaze fixed in our direction. Without hesitation, The woman disposed of the wine, concealing the glass in a nearby plant container, and urged me to move aside, directing me towards the shop adjacent to the Chinese restaurant. She assured me she would confront Johnny, buying me some time. Instructing me to call the police immediately, I complied without delay, dialing 911 on my mobile phone. Seeking refuge in the nearby convenience store, akin to a 7-Eleven, I relayed the harrowing events to the shopkeeper, who promptly guided me to the back rooms, securing the door behind me. I dialed emergency services from their landline, remaining hidden until the police arrived. Upon investigation, Johnny had vanished, purportedly walking home according to the woman's account. Despite CCTV evidence from city cameras, authorities couldn't trace his whereabouts or uncover his true identity. The dating app failed to provide any leads, leaving him unapprehended. I never learned the name of the woman who intervened, but she was my guardian angel that day. Without her swift action, I dread to think what Johnny had planned. This experience has left me shaken, and I haven't ventured on a date since. It's a sobering reminder of the dangers of online dating, and I'm grateful to the shopkeeper and the anonymous woman who saved me from a potentially dire outcome. Story 2. So the story goes, I was 19 in 2014, and I found myself on my first date with a guy I met at the bowling alley. Back then, I was out and about quite often, avoiding home where arguments between my parents were a constant source of stress. It wasn't a pleasant environment for a teenager, so I sought any opportunity to escape, whether it meant staying over at friends' places for days or even resorting to dates just to avoid being at home. Yeah, it was that bad. I was willing to go to great lengths just to not have to stay there. But my luck ran out on one particular date during that year. It was when I met this guy for the first time, someone I'd exchanged numbers with after meeting at the bowling alley with friends. We decided to go on a date, just the two of us, opting for something simple and teenage like a trip to Walmart for snacks, and then off to the local park. Despite having only met him once, he seemed chill, and I didn't see any warning signs that would deter me from agreeing to go to the park with him at night. I prided myself on being a good judge of character, a skill I attributed to growing up in a household filled with tension and arguments. I learned to read my parents' emotions, anticipating when my dad might explode in anger or when my mom was stressed or scared. This translated into my ability to read other people's behaviors. And this guy from the bowling alley gave off genuine and natural vibes. Little did I know, this first date story wasn't about him. After our trip to Walmart, we drove to the park in his truck. The park had a skate park and some sort of bowl structure for skateboarders. Although I wasn't familiar with skating, we sat near this bowl in the darkness, with no one else around. It was eerily quiet and pitch black. I casually munched on a pack of Cheetos, not caring about my breath around him, which seems funny to me now. I believe he was drinking soda, though my memory is fuzzy. I just remember him with a can. The details of what we ate and what happened next are a bit hazy in my memory. However, what occurred a few minutes into our snack session will forever be etched in my mind. We sat there in the silence of the night, enjoying the slight breeze. It was a pleasant evening, not too cold or too warm. I recall wearing a jacket, jeans, and Vans. Suddenly, a few minutes into the date, while I was munching on Cheetos, we heard rustling in the bushes behind us. There was a cluster of trees and bushes behind the skate park and bowl where we sat with our feet dangling off the edge. The noise emanated directly from behind us. I turned to the guy sitting on my right, and he froze, lowering his soda can and dropping it between us. Slowly, he turned around, attempting to discern the source of the noise. After about 2 seconds, the noise ceased. It sounded like someone heavy climbing out of a bush, loud and unmistakable. The guy looked directly at me, and I had stopped eating my Cheetos, frozen with fear. He turned and remarked, "It's probably just a cat. Or maybe a dog. What else could it be?" It was nearly midnight, and we were in the park without a light on our eyes adjusted to the darkness, but not enough to see through the bushes. The moon, almost full, illuminated most of the area outside the clear space where we sat. However, we couldn't see what lurked behind us, though we sensed something there. A few more minutes passed, and we ceased eating and drinking, sitting there frozen, trying to listen. It really killed the vibe of the date, as we felt genuinely watched or stalked. Eventually, the noise resumed, even louder this time. The guy next to me swore he saw something move between two bushes and tensed up. He got up, grabbed his can, and hurled it into the bushes, hoping to scare off whatever was there, but there was no reaction. He threw the can, which was still half full and heavy, yet there was silence afterward. At that point, I insisted that we leave. We gathered our belongings and the snacks we had laid out, packing them into his bag, and headed back to his truck. The parking lot was only about 10 steps from the bowl, where we had been sitting. As we returned to his truck and placed the bag of snacks in the trunk, we spotted a figure behind the bushes, a person in a clown outfit, brandishing what appeared to be a 20-inch machete blade, stained with what looked like blood. My date let out a scream, the likes of which I'd never heard from a 21-year-old guy, as if he hadn't hit puberty yet. He fumbled for the keys, desperately trying to unlock the driver's side door. I began screaming and panicking, my whole body trembling uncontrollably. The guy struggled to unlock the door, as his old truck lacked automatic unlocking. He had to turn the key in the lock, but his panic made it difficult. I stood behind the truck, crouching down, occasionally glancing over at the clown holding a sword, but he remained still. It didn't occur to me that this might be a prank. It wasn't Halloween or April Fool's Day, and I didn't see any YouTubers with cameras around. Finally, my date managed to insert the key into the lock. He swung open the door and reached into the glove box, pulling out a handgun. Without hesitation, he began firing rounds in the direction of the clown. Startled, the clown retreated into the bushes, and my date ceased fire immediately. He tossed the gun back into the glove box, urging me to get in the car. I complied, and we slammed the door shut. He hit the gas, and we sped away, disregarding all stop signs. I'm not proud of it, but in that moment, it felt like our lives were in danger. I don't know what that clown was thinking or what they had planned, but it was the most terrifying experience of my life, and it happened on one of my first dates. Ironically, that guy ended up protecting me. Story 3. I was on a first date with a girl who almost choked to death in the cinema. We decided to watch the Transformers movie, not knowing what else to watch, thinking it would be goofy and funny. We endured the usual pre-rolls and long adverts, or at least it felt that way. She got a large popcorn, I grabbed some Twizzlers and soda, and we found seats close to the front, about 3 rows from the screen. My eyes were already straining, I had forgotten my glasses, so I spent the entire film squinting and burning my retinas. About halfway through the movie, she started choking. After the 5th cough, I realized it wasn't just a regular cough, something was stuck in her throat. Somehow she had swallowed a piece of popcorn without chewing it properly, and it got lodged in her airway. She was choking, and I had no idea what to do. I didn't know first aid, but there we were, in a crowded cinema, and she couldn't breathe. The first thing that came to mind was that maneuver where you stand behind someone and squeeze their ribs to dislodge whatever is stuck. I didn't even know what it was called, but I'd seen videos online, and I knew it worked. It baffled me how something as small and soft as popcorn could cause such a problem, but I guess she had swallowed it without chewing properly. And maybe she was 6 or 7 at once. Well, there we were, stood in the middle of each lane on the steps of the cinema, and I was trying to get this popcorn out of her throat while the film was still running. By this point, a bunch of people had now got our attention and realized what was going on. It must have been around 2 whole minutes now, and the girl had been choking, still not properly breathing. So a bunch of people carried her out into the hallway, shut the door to the cinema, and proceeded to call the first aiders and security over. They called 911. But eventually, someone managed to do this weird maneuver, where they put her arms above her head and then squeezed her lower torso. This choked, and a couple of bits of popcorn came out of her mouth. Then she started gasping for air. All the while, her face went bright red, as she had now almost died on her first date with me, watching Transformers at the cinema. Yeah, this wasn't her proudest first moment, but believe it or not, this is my current girlfriend to this day. Yeah, this is the day we'll talk about when we get married, and we're engaged as of now. So when we have the wedding next year, that'll probably be, well, my best man speech. You see, he wasn't there, but I've relayed the story to him many times, and he always goes on about how hilarious it is. Thinking back on it, now it is kind of funny, but in the moment, it wasn't. I can laugh with her now about this, but the reality is she could have died that night, and I don't think anyone wants to die watching a film at the cinema because of popcorn getting wedged in their airways. Eventually, someone did manage to save her another way, like to say I saved her life. The reality was, I didn't have a clue about how to save her or what maneuver did anything. I doubt I'd even know how to put someone in the recovery position if I needed to. And that's kind of worrying. I should probably sign myself up for the local first aid course. This was a shock and an eye-opener, but also something we always talk about to this day. Story 4. I had been looking for over a month now on the singles date site I had registered with, wading through all the supposed matches after I'd filled in my online profile. I had ensured all along not to give out any personal information like my full name and address, but as per the security guidelines on the site. And as I was a female who lived alone, I certainly did not want to let my guard down. I put on my profile that I was a social person who liked going out to restaurants, film nights, etc. I liked tracking, running, and swimming. I also put down that I was 5'8" with shoulder-length blonde hair, and that I was in my mid-30s. You could provide a picture of yourself against your profile if you wanted, but lots of women did not, and I was one of them. However, most of the men did, even though most inserted a picture when they were much younger. So you always tended to view the pictures supplied as questionable, at least until proven wrong when you first meet them. It was Thursday night. I'd finished my office job for the day. I worked for a big insurance company in downtown Chicago. You would think working in an office so I'd meet loads of potential guys, but trust me, I dated 3 in the company over a course of a year. And they all turned out to be total jerks on the first date. So I decided to see if I searched online, maybe I could get a better standard of candidate, or that's what I hoped anyway. Well, this night I had 7 possible candidates sent my contact date site. As I waded through them and read their profiles, and then looked at their supposed photos, I soon whittled them down to just one possible candidate. According to the info he supplied, his name was Lucas, and he was 30 years old. He claimed to be 6 foot tall, but we know how many people claim that as well. He went on to say that he liked all sports and enjoyed meeting new people and going out to restaurants. And he also said that he enjoyed the outdoor life, which I did too. Over the next 4 nights, we exchanged chatty emails over the dating site platform. Lucas came across as a sort of nice guy, and if his picture were to be believed, he was also good-looking. So after a lot of consideration, we arranged and agreed to meet in a downtown food and wine bar called Benny's. We agreed to meet Saturday nights at 8 p.m. The idea was to wear a small red carnation or rose so that we could recognize each other when we walked in. We also agreed whoever got there first was to get a table and wait. It was Saturday afternoon, and I had been nervous all day about the anticipation of the date. And also, what was I going to wear, hair up or down, all the usual things that I was just worrying about. I had been down to the local florist and purchased a small bunch of red carnations. I chose the best one and cut it off, then fitted it with this small pin to the left side of my new dress that I bought. I decided to get to the bar a bit early. So I arrived at 7:30 and got a table and looked around. I ordered a martini on the rocks from the bar and sat at the table and waited. I looked around the bar as I waited. It seemed to be a mix of people. Some were couples, others seemed to be large groups of guys out for the town on the night. There were even several tables of just women enjoying themselves. I looked at my watch and it was now 8:20. I looked around and there was no single guy in here wearing a red carnation or rose like we agreed. Great, I thought he was a no-show. How insulting was that? He could have at least turned up, and if he did not like what he saw, he could have made an excuse and then left. I decided to wait another 10 minutes, which would make it 8:30. And then I was deciding to go. I decided to walk to the bar and back, just in case he hadn't seen me with the red carnation on in the now busy bar. I was praying this wasn't the case, seeing as I basically scanned my eyes upon everyone in the bar, and no one looked like the guy in the profile I'd been talking to. So either I'd been catfished hard or he was actually not there. Finally, it was 8:30 on the dot. I got up and headed for the door. I took one last look around and out the door I went. I decided to walk the 15 minutes it would take me to get back to my apartment. The street was well lit and there were lots of people about. I was walking slowly, but I became aware of a feeling that I was being followed. I stopped a couple of times and tried to look around as naturally as possible, but each time I could not pick anyone out in particular. As I stopped at the next shop window, I looked and I could see a man for the first time in a long dark coat. He was carrying a black and silver cane in his right hand. He also then looked across the street as soon as I turned round. When I started off again, so did he. Now I was getting worried. I started walking faster. This part of the street had fewer people on it and it was less residential. I crossed the street to see if he did the same, and yes, he did. I turned left onto my street. And to my horror, the 2 streetlights leading to my entrance door were not on, so the sidewalk was in total darkness, except some dim lights coming from houses opposite. That was it. I sprinted for my flat entrance, and I went up the stairs and pulled open the community door. I went in and got in the lift and pressed the 4th floor. As the doors were closing, suddenly a cane shot out from nowhere and stopped the doors closing. The sensors from the elevator doors reopened them again. I froze in terror, the lift doors opened, and the large figure of a man in the dark coat stepped inside. He was carrying a knife in his other hand. It was then that I noticed his face was hidden by a balaclava. I began screaming uncontrollably as this man just stood in front of me. All of a sudden, someone else swiftly entered the lift wearing a suit. This man had a red rose on the collar. He grabbed the man around the neck and screamed out, "Please drop the knife." He began teasing the guy from behind, and the man collapsed in the elevator with me stood in front of them. The suited man disarmed the man and cuffed him. He then introduced himself as my date Lucas. He apologized for being late and said that he saw my red carnation on my dress when he left. So as he tried to catch up with me, he became aware of this guy acting strangely and following me. So it just happens Lucas is a Chicago policeman. Lucky for me, right place, right time. It turned out this creep was wanted for multiple attacks on women over the 6-month period. So eventually, Lucas and I got to go on a date. We got on great, and we're now seeing each other on a regular basis. The fear I felt afterward was like none other. They had to send the medics out because I simply couldn't stop shaking. The adrenaline in my body was being pounded around by my heart, and it was so scary that I thought I was going to die just from panic. After all this, my date Luke has calmed me down. He stayed with me after cooling another unit. He restrained this creep and eventually got him taken away in a police car. The man was charged and found guilty on so many different counts. I can't even remember how many. The reality was my date was a police officer. He was late to his date. He was late to our date. But it doesn't really matter when he saved my life.